It was the summer of 1955, and the heat in Claiborne County, Mississippi was the kind that sat on your shoulders like a debt you couldn't repay. On a stretch of red clay road outside Port Gibson, an old man stood at the edge of a gravel lot, hat in hand, staring at a whitewashed building with a hand-painted cross above the door. He had been coming to that church since he was 7 years old. His mother had been baptized inside those walls. His father had been carried out of them in a pine box. And now, without warning, without mercy, without so much as a conversation, a piece of paper had been nailed to the front door, telling him it no longer belonged to his people. Someone far away had made a decision. And that decision was going to swallow 50 years of faith whole. What that old man didn't know was that word was about to travel. And the man it would reach was the last person anyone in Hollywood or Mississippi would have expected. Reverend Elias Calhoun had spent 31 years as the spiritual shepherd of Calvary Praise Baptist Church. He was 64 years old, slightly stooped from decades of farm work and prayer, and he carried himself with the kind of dignity that doesn't come from money or status, but from choosing every single morning to rise anyway. His congregation was small, never more than 90 souls on the best of Sundays, and they were all working people. Sharecroppers, domestic labourers, a few small farmers who rented land they would never own. They passed a collection plate that, on a good week, might yield $12. But that church was not a building to them. It was the only place in Claiborne County where they could speak freely, grieve openly, and believe without apology. The church had been built in 1901 by the congregation's founding members, most of them formerly enslaved men and women who had scraped together lumber and sweat and prayer to raise something that was entirely, defiantly theirs. The deed had been held for decades by a sympathetic white attorney in Port Gibson named Harlan Beckett, who had allowed the congregation to maintain use of the property under a long-standing informal agreement. When Beckett died in the spring of 1955, his estate fell into the hands of a nephew in Memphis named Gerald Thorpe, a man who had no connection to Claiborne County, no relationship to the congregation, and no patience for informal agreements. Thorpe had received a cash offer for the property from a land developer looking to expand a supply depot along the county road. The offer was $320, not a princely sum even by the standards of 1955 Mississippi, but enough for a man who had inherited the land and felt no obligation to the people on it. Thorpe accepted without negotiation, without notification, and without conscience. A notice was filed, a deed was transferred, and within 2 weeks of old Harlan Beckett being put in the ground, Calvary Praise Baptist Church had been sold out from under its congregation. Reverend Calhoun received the eviction notice on a Thursday morning. He read it 3 times, sitting at the kitchen table of his small home, his wife Ruth standing behind him with her hand on his shoulder, not saying anything because there was nothing to say. His grandson Marcus, who was 9 years old and had already memorized the 23rd Psalm at that church's vacation Bible school, asked his grandfather from the doorway why he was crying. Calhoun told the boy he wasn't crying, but he was. The congregation gathered that Sunday anyway in the building they no longer owned, singing hymns that had been sung there for 50 years, praying with a desperation that was more honest than comfort. Some of them wept openly. Others stared at the walls with the hollow look of people trying to memorize something before it disappears. They were not a wealthy congregation. They could not simply rebuild or relocate or litigate. They had no political power in a Mississippi still strangled by Jim Crow. They had no recourse except faith, and faith that particular Sunday felt very thin. By Monday, the story was circulating quietly, the way stories moved in those days through coloured neighbourhoods, through the back doors of diners and the front porches of rooming houses. It was the kind of story that decent people heard, and then set aside. Because what could decent people do? The law had been followed. Technically, the papers had been signed. The world had looked the other way, as it so often did, and Reverend Elias Calhoun had begun the quiet heartbreak of accepting that the place where his mother had been baptized was going to become a supply depot for someone's commercial ambition. 3 weeks after the eviction notice was posted, a large black automobile rolled slowly down the red clay road outside Port Gibson and came to a stop in front of Calvary Praise Baptist Church. The man who stepped out was tall, well over 6 feet broad through the shoulders, and dressed not in the finery you might expect of someone driving a car like that, but in plain work clothes. Dark trousers, a simple shirt, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low against the Mississippi sun. He stood for a long moment studying the building, the way a man studies something he's trying to understand rather than simply observe. He had not been sent by anyone. He had not been organised by a committee or dispatched by a studio or prompted by a publicist managing his image. He had heard the story, the way many things reached him through an acquaintance, through the informal networks of people who knew people, through a chain of conversations that had eventually found its way to a man sitting in a hotel room in Shreveport, Louisiana, where he had been on location for a film production. He had listened, asked a few questions, and then gone quiet in the way that men do when they have already made up their mind but haven't announced it yet. The man walked the perimeter of the small church, hands in his pockets, boots crunching softly on gravel. He peered through the window at the plain wooden pews, the simple wooden cross on the wall behind the pulpit, the hand-stitched altar cloth that a woman in the congregation had made in 1923. He did not perform this inspection with the detachment of a property buyer. He looked at it the way a man looks at something that matters. A young boy, Marcus Calhoun, as it happened, was sitting on a fence post 50 yards down the road, watching with the frank curiosity of a 9-year-old. He would later tell his grandmother that the tall man stood outside the church for a long time by himself, just looking, that he took off his hat at one point and held it against his chest, the way men did when they were standing near something they respected, that he didn't look like trouble. He looked, the boy said, like he was sorry about something. No one in Claiborne County knew who this man was. He had no public reason to be there. He had not contacted the congregation, had not called ahead, had not introduced himself to anyone. He had simply come to see for himself whether the thing he had heard was true. And standing there in the August heat with his hat against his chest and red Mississippi dust on his boots, he had seen enough. Was Marion Robert Morrison. The world knew him as John Wayne. He was, in the summer of 1955, arguably the most famous man in America. He had just completed the filming of a major studio production. He was one of the highest paid actors in Hollywood, and his face was so recognizable that he could not walk through an airport without stopping traffic. He was also, by every public measure, a product of his era, a conservative man, a man who had made his career playing the American myth at its most unambiguous. People who knew his politics, who had read his interviews, who had assumed that they understood what he believed and who he stood for, would not have predicted this. Wayne located the attorney handling the estate through a contact in Memphis. He did not use an intermediary for the next step. He made the call himself, identified himself by name, and inquired about the status of the Calvary Praise Baptist Church property in Claiborne County. The attorney on the other end of the line was, by several accounts, briefly speechless. Wayne asked what it would take to reverse the sale. He was told that Gerald Thorpe had already accepted a cash offer and that the transaction was in its final stages, but had not yet been formally recorded with the county. There was, the attorney allowed, a narrow window. Wayne asked for a number. He was given one. He did not negotiate. He did not pause to consider. He agreed to the price on the spot which, including the cost of legal fees to unwind the original sale and record a new deed, came to just under $600. He arranged for the funds to be transferred within 48 hours. He also asked that the deed be transferred directly into the name of the Calvary Praise Baptist Church congregation, with no strings attached, no conditions, no reversions. He wanted the paperwork to be unambiguous. The church would own its own building. When asked at the end of the call whether he wanted any acknowledgement for what he was doing, whether he wanted a letter, a statement, any form of recognition, Wayne said no. He said he did not want his name anywhere near the transaction. He did not want the congregation to feel obligated to him. He did not want it in the papers. He simply wanted the church returned to the people it belonged to. The papers were drawn up. The original sale was unwound. The deed was recorded with Claiborne County. And Calvary Praise Baptist Church, in a legal and permanent and unambiguous sense, became the property of its congregation for the first time in its 54-year history. It was Reverend Calhoun's nephew, a young man named Thomas who worked at a law office in Jackson, who first understood what had happened and who had made it happen. He had been quietly tracking the paperwork through a contact at the county recorder's office when he noticed the name on the transaction that had reversed the original sale. He read it once, he read it again. Then he sat down in his chair and did not speak for nearly a full minute. He drove to Port Gibson that same evening. He found his uncle on the porch in the last of the day's light. He told him what the paperwork said. Calhoun listened without interrupting, which was unusual for a preacher. When Thomas finished, the old man was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the tree line where the fireflies were beginning to rise in the dusk. Ruth came to the screen door, heard the last of it, and pressed her hand flat against the doorframe to steady herself. Word moved through the congregation with the particular electricity of something almost too large to hold. They gathered the following Sunday, not just to worship, but to bear witness to a thing they were still struggling to understand. The church was full, more than full. People stood outside the open windows and in the doorway, listening as Calhoun preached not about John Wayne, because the Reverend was careful to redirect all gratitude upward, but about the ways grace sometimes arrives in the forms you least expect, through the hands of people you might never have imagined. Young Marcus, sitting in the front row in his Sunday shirt, asked his grandmother after the service whether the tall man from Hollywood was a good man. Ruth Calhoun thought about it for a moment. She told the boy that a good man was someone who did the right thing when nobody was looking and asked for nothing in return. She told him that seemed about right. No one contacted John Wayne. No statement was issued on his behalf. No magazine ran the story. For months, the whole episode existed only in the lived memory of a small congregation in Mississippi and in a set of legal documents filed in Claiborne County documents that confirmed what had happened but said nothing about why. John Wayne himself never spoke publicly about what he had done in Mississippi in the summer of 1955. Not in interviews, not in the authorized biographical accounts of his career, not in the conversations that his friends and colleagues later recalled and documented. It stayed beneath the surface of his public life, the way certain things do not because he was ashamed of them, but because they belonged to a part of himself that he did not perform. What we know comes from two primary sources. The first is the county records of Claiborne County, Mississippi, which document the transaction with the plain and indifferent accuracy of bureaucratic paperwork. The second is a private letter written by Reverend Elias Calhoun in 1961, discovered decades later among his personal effects addressed to John Wayne and never sent. In it, Calhoun writes with the measured eloquence of a man who has spent his life finding language for the things that resist it. He describes what the church meant to his congregation. He describes the day the eviction notice arrived. And then he writes, quietly, that he had long ago stopped trying to explain to people how a man's legacy is not always built from the things the world can see, that some of the most important things a human being ever does are the ones that happen in the silence between his public self and his private one. It was sometime in late 1956, through a circuitous chain of acquaintances, that John Wayne learned the congregation had found out it was him. He was in Arizona when he received that information. According to the man who told him, Wayne's only response was to nod slowly and say, in that unmistakable measured drawl, that he was glad the place was still standing. That was all. No eloquent declaration, no performance of generosity, just a quiet man, satisfied that a thing had been made right, already looking forward to what came next. The congregation of Calvary Praise Baptist Church worshipped in that building for another 40 years. Reverend Calhoun presided until 1973, when age finally took the pulpit from him. Marcus Calhoun, the boy who had watched a tall stranger stand in the gravel lot with his hat against his chest, grew up to become a schoolteacher in Port Gibson. He told the story to his students every year. Not as a story about John Wayne exactly, as a story about what people are actually made of once you get past what they show the world. As a story about the private self, the self that acts when no camera is rolling and no crowd is watching and nothing is at stake except whether you can live with what you see in the mirror. There is a photograph taken in the mid-1960s of Calvary Praise Baptist Church on an ordinary Sunday morning. The congregation is streaming out of the front doors into summer light. The cross above the door is the same hand-painted one that had been there since the building went up. The altar cloth is visible through the open door, still intact, still stitched by hands that are now long gone. Nothing in the photograph marks it as unusual. It simply looks like what it is, a community of people leaving a place of worship that belongs to them. That is what $600 and one quiet decision looked like 50 years on. We tell ourselves stories about heroes because we need them to be large. We need them to arrive with fanfare, to declare themselves, to be unmistakable, and sometimes they are. But every now and then, history slips a different kind of figure through the door, someone who acts not because the world is watching, but because they cannot tolerate the alternative. Someone who hears about an injustice in a county they have no connection to, and decides, privately and permanently, that it is their problem too. John Wayne was a complicated man, as all men of stature and era are. He carried the contradictions of his time. He was not a saint. But on a summer day in 1955, he stood in a gravel lot in Mississippi and saw something that needed to be made right. And he made it right, and then he walked away without asking for anything in return. That is not a small thing. In a decade when the South was boiling with a violence designed specifically to crush the dignity of black Americans, when churches were being bombed, when people were being killed for registering to vote, when the machinery of intimidation ran without interference, one man chose quietly, personally, to push back. Not with a speech, not with a camera crew, with a check and a phone call and a request that his name be kept out of it. What does that tell us about who we are, or who we could be, when the world isn't watching? Tell us in the comments what this story means to you, and whether you believe the quietest acts of decency are sometimes the most powerful ones history never gets to record. Because stories like this one deserve to be remembered, and the people who lived them deserve to be honoured.